The officers didn't even bother asking for his name. To them, he was just another suspicious black man who fit a description, a shadow in the night they could pin their assumptions on. But when he stood in the courtroom and began to speak, the air itself seemed to freeze. The truth of who he was struck the room like a thunderbolt. They had thrown behind bars a man before whom senators and judges once bowed. What unfolded next left everyone in shock. But to fully understand, we need to return to where it all began. Millbrook, a small and unassuming city, was settling into the quiet of the late evening. The streets, dimly lit by scattered streetlights, were largely deserted. A handful of pedestrians, workers returning home, night owls running errands, hurried along, eager to escape the encroaching chill of the night air. James Carter, a man in his 40s with a tall, composed stature, stepped out of a 24-hour convenience store. In one hand, he carried a bottle of water. In the other, a Snickers bar. It had been a long day at work, and all he wanted was to enjoy a moment of peace before heading home. His car was parked just around the corner, where the shadows of the buildings stretched across the pavement like long, black fingers. As James rounded the corner, the sharp screech of tires shattered the fragile silence. A patrol car roared to a stop directly in front of him, its red and blue lights flashing wildly. The sudden burst of activity felt jarring, intrusive, as if the quiet night had been ripped apart by an unseen force. "Hands where I can see them! Slowly!" barked one of the officers as he emerged from the vehicle. His flashlight beam, harsh and unrelenting, stabbed directly into James's eyes, forcing him to squint. "What's this about, officer?" James asked, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. Slowly, he raised his hands, careful not to make any sudden movements. He knew the unspoken rules in situations like this, the precarious tightrope he had to walk to avoid escalating things further. But before he could get another word in, a second officer materialized behind him. This one wasted no time. His grip on James's shoulder was firm, almost aggressive, as he reached for the cold steel of his handcuffs. "You match the description," the second officer said tersely. "Black male, tall, wearing dark clothing." James blinked, momentarily stunned by the absurdity of the accusation. "What description? I just came out of the store. Look, here's the receipt," he said, raising the small slip of paper in his hand as evidence of his innocence. His explanation, however, fell on deaf ears. The officer behind him twisted his arm sharply, yanking it behind his back with unnecessary force. "Relax," the officer growled, "or we'll add resisting arrest to the list." A small crowd began to form outside the store, drawn by the commotion. Among them, a woman in pajamas leaned out of her window, her face etched with disbelief. "You didn't even check his ID!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Stay out of this, ma'am," snapped the first officer, his tone harsh and dismissive. "This has nothing to do with you." The officer's words, however, did little to quell the growing unease among the onlookers. One by one, smartphones emerged, their cameras capturing every detail of the unfolding scene. Yet the officers seemed unbothered, too consumed by their authority to consider the implications of their actions. "I haven't done anything wrong," James said, his voice firm but measured. He knew better than to raise it, even though his frustration was mounting. The officers, however, remained indifferent. They shoved him toward the patrol car, ignoring the murmurs of protest from the bystanders. At the station, James was led directly into a stark, dimly lit interrogation room. The walls were a dull gray, devoid of any warmth or humanity, and the air was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant. One officer sat across from him, turning on a recording device and opening a folder with an air of practiced disdain. "Let's keep this simple," the officer began, his tone dripping with condescension. "Where were you an hour ago?" "At work," James replied evenly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm an attorney." The officers exchanged glances, their smirks betraying their disbelief. "An attorney?" one of them sneered. "Yeah, sure. We'll let the court sort that out." Without another word, they marched him out of the room and into a holding cell. James was denied the opportunity to make a phone call, a basic right, as if the officers were intent on stripping him of every semblance of dignity. The cell was cold and uninviting, with bare walls that seemed to close in on him as the hours dragged on. 2 days passed in that desolate space, each second feeling heavier than the last. James had no way of reaching anyone, no voice to speak on his behalf. He was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of the injustice he was enduring pressing down on him like a physical burden. By the time the day of the trial arrived, the courtroom was already buzzing with anticipation. Word of the arrest had spread like wildfire, thanks in large part to the video that one of the bystanders had posted online. Journalists, activists, and concerned citizens filled the room, their faces a mix of outrage and curiosity. James, still in handcuffs, was led into the courtroom like a criminal paraded for public judgment. The officers who had arrested him stood off to the side, their expressions smug and self-assured. They seemed confident that this would be just another routine case, a quick guilty plea, a few formalities, and another victory for the system. The case of the state versus James Carter, the clerk announced, their voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. The judge, an older white man with a stern countenance, adjusted his glasses and glanced at the prosecutor. "State your charges," he said, his tone brisk and authoritative. The prosecutor, a young man who exuded arrogance, rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended under suspicious circumstances. He refused to provide identification and displayed hostility toward the arresting officers. We believe he deliberately concealed his identity." James remained silent, his expression unreadable as the prosecutor laid out his version of the events. But when the judge finally turned to him and asked him to state his identity, James's response sent shock waves through the room. "My name is James Andrew Carter," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "I am a retired federal judge." Furthermore, the judge's voice, now carrying the weight of justice, reverberated through the courtroom. "An official investigation into the conduct of Officers Brady and Miller is now underway." Brady and Miller, the officers at the center of the storm, froze in place. Their faces, once smug and filled with unwarranted confidence, now betrayed their growing fear. Brady, the senior officer, attempted to speak, but his voice wavered as he stammered, "Well, what?" The judge didn't flinch. His next words struck like a gavel pounding down finality. "You are both suspended from duty," he declared, effective immediately and pending further review. A ripple of astonishment swept through the courtroom, and then the silence shattered. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Activists, reporters, and citizens who had come to witness the trial cheered and clapped, their voices merging into a chorus of vindication. The officers stood motionless, their fists clenched tightly at their sides. Their rigid postures could not mask the realization dawning on them. This was the end of the road for their careers. The prosecutor, who moments before had exuded arrogance, now appeared visibly shaken. Swallowing hard, he ventured, "Your Honor, at least allow us to—" "No, at least, Mr. Collins," the judge interrupted, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. "This case will set an example for the entire country. Justice is not a tool for bias or personal prejudice, and it never will be." With those words, James Carter, the man whose dignity had been trampled but never broken, finally removed his handcuffs. He stood tall and composed, his presence commanding attention without the need for any display of anger or resentment. Turning slowly toward the two officers, his gaze locked onto theirs. His eyes were cold, but they held no hatred, only the weight of truth. "You didn't know who I was," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "but it doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you saw the color of my skin and assumed guilt. Let this be a lesson, not just for you, but for everyone." The courtroom was silent again, but the message reverberated far beyond those four walls. By the evening, the story had spread like wildfire. Footage from the trial circulated across major news channels, social media platforms, and the front pages of national newspapers. The headline that dominated them all read, "White officers arrest black man without cause. He turns out to be a federal judge." The accompanying video captured every pivotal moment: the unjust arrest, the courtroom revelation, and the judge's scathing rebuke. The scandal ignited conversations nationwide, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. The next morning, the fallout began in earnest. Millbrook's chief of police, Thomas Grayson, held an emergency press conference outside the police station. Flanked by his staff, he addressed a sea of reporters, their microphones and cameras poised to capture every word. "We acknowledge that serious mistakes were made in the handling of this case," Grayson admitted, his tone measured but strained. "An internal investigation has been launched, and we will be thoroughly reviewing our detainment procedures to ensure incidents like this never happen again." A reporter, her voice sharp and unrelenting, shouted from the crowd, "Chief Grayson, do you admit that the arrest was racially motivated?" Grayson hesitated, his face tightening as he struggled to find the right words. "We cannot comment on the motives until the investigation is complete," he finally said, but it was too late. Outside the police station, a crowd had gathered, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for James Carter! Police reform now!" The protests swelled as the hours passed, drawing citizens from all walks of life. Signs and banners waved in the air, emblazoned with slogans demanding systemic change. The public's anger was palpable, a reflection of years of pent-up frustration with a system many believed to be deeply flawed. Under mounting pressure, the city's mayor released a statement later that afternoon. "We cannot allow bias to erode public trust in our justice system," the statement read. "This case must serve as a turning point, not just for our city, but for the nation as a whole." Meanwhile, the spotlight on Officers Brady and Miller intensified. Investigative journalists began digging into their pasts, uncovering a troubling pattern of misconduct. Reports surfaced of multiple complaints filed against both officers, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. "This isn't their first offense," an anchor on a major news network reported during a primetime broadcast. Records show a history of allegations against both officers, raising questions about the department's oversight and accountability measures. As the revelations piled up, public outrage deepened. Protests outside the police station grew larger, with demonstrators demanding not only justice for James Carter, but also a complete overhaul of the department's policies.